Okay, so I'm going to start, and I know some more people will trickle back in. So I am Garance Genicot. I'm professor at Georgetown University and delighted to be here. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel on financial theory and macroeconomics in development. You know, I'm neither a finance person or a macroeconomics person, so this is going to be very interesting to me. But the panel brings together, thankfully, three of the most influential thinkers in the field. So Robert Townsend from MIT, whose pioneer work on informal risk sharing in India and his work on village in Thailand have shaped how we think about, finance and village economics. We have Douglas Diamond from the Chicago Boot, whose foundational theories of financial intermediation and fragility have transformed modern banking theory. And we have Chang-Tai Hsieh from also Chicago Boot, who is a leading scholar on economic growth, structural transformation, and the role of government in development. I am not going to start citing the title and number of prizes because it would take half the time that we have been allocated for this panel, and I thought you would actually prefer to hear what they have to say. So over the next hour, what we are going to do is to explore how financial theory and macroeconomics can eliminate development challenge in a world of rapid technological change and new data. And so, the first thing that I wanted to tell you about is about the role of theory and what I see as important, as already mentioned before. In development economics, there's a moment where it felt like theory was disappearing and did not have a role anymore, or apparently not a role anymore in thinking about the development problem. And so what I wanted to tell you a little bit about, I wanted to push back a little bit against that view. I wanted to tell you a little bit about, the state of theory, or what I see as the very exciting change that I see in development. And I wanted to just give a few cues about how maybe they can be applied to, the problem of finance and insist on the macroeconomic application. So let me tell you a little bit about why I think that theory remains central in development economics. And I think that there's three very important roles. One that is normative, about what policies and institutions should look like and how do we think about even designing them. Positive role, model-based, what people do, estimating key parameters and understanding. And, even descriptive, like even with, big data mining, pure predictive thing, what do we even measure in those data? And I think that theory has a role in terms of thinking about this. So let me first tell you a little bit about, the normative role of theory in economics more generally, and thinking about development and applies about, when we think about designing taxes, designing auction, designing credit program, there's an infinite set of possible designs that could exist. And we cannot randomize every single design to start with. So we need to start with some theory in order to guide the choices of the program that we want to test. So we need to be thinking about predicting some unintended consequences, selecting among possible instruments. And, in finance, there's a lot of example in terms of designing deposit insurance, mobile money regulation, And, incentive and enforcement might be very different in developing country. And before applying what exists in, developed economy to developing country, maybe we need to start with like modeling, thinking about the unintended consequences. Also, in terms of model-based analytics, I think there's a very important loop between descriptive and theory, and we need to think about, merging the evidence that we get within a theoretical model and to reinforce it. There's very nice I think, there's very nice developments now that are happening in the literature where I see that loop happening. So there was a paper in the GEL in 24 by Todd and Wolpin that was devoted to the link between RCT and structural model. So the idea is how to combine RCT and the nice micro estimation identification with larger structural model. And what do we do with it? And they, to be able to estimate the key parameters, to be able to conduct counterfactuals, to have some welfare impact, we need actually to think about some theory. And so the RCT data can validate and sharpen the structural models by using treatment and control both as holdout and as identifying variation. So when we think about, in finance application, we can think about randomizing credit and saving intervention with structural household firm finance models to recover the key elasticities to be able to actually make out implication for the for welfare, for general effect model. So I want to highlight in particular, in this view of the role of theory, two very, very exciting model or part of application. So there's an amazing paper by Tisha Agag, 2024, where she's using theory and structural estimation to actually identify a very, very important problem. So in a setting where we have positive spillover, where we have multiple equilibria, it is very difficult with the tools that we normally have to say anything. Okay, so are we talking when we are doing and looking at the data and we see a change, are we talking about a change of equilibrium, or are we within an equilibrium and looking at change at the margin? She has an amazing paper where she's actually using theory to actually be able to estimate when you see a change. She's applying it to industrial zone and agglomeration effect, but to be able to say how much and distinguish how much of the change that we are seeing when you have a push for industrial zoning and see development, is it coming from a change of equilibrium or is it coming to within an equilibrium? And she's able to say that about 38% of the observed unemployment growth is attributable to equilibrium switching. So I'm not going to explain how she does it, but this is certainly something that is interesting to look at. And in finance, there's a lot of setting where you have multiple equilibria, and maybe it can be applied. I think also very exciting work that I see in micro-macro intersection is to be thinking about the missing intercept problem. So when you have a positive spillover, you can compare the setting, the treated units with the control, but everybody is receiving a general equilibrium effect that you cannot identify by just comparing your treated and your control group. And that's called the missing intercept. And so there's very, exciting work that is looking at using the RCT to be looking at, the micro perspective, but then using a GE model to actually be able to identify the missing intercept. And so, I want to give you some example of Bushbeek or Donaldson and Hornbeck, like those. There's a lot of recent papers that I'm seeing that are at that intersection, and I think is very exciting. And then finally, the last role of theory is like, okay, even if you just use the data, do a prediction analysis and so on, where, what are you measuring? Okay, so how do you build the outcome that you're interested in, or the variable that you're interested in? So, we have in development many cases of measuring inequality, measuring polarization, measuring, mobility. This is work that I have done, measuring some, centrality in network. We need theory to be able to even define what we want to actually measure. Otherwise, you could have an infinite number of outcomes that you can measure, and again, that's data mining. Okay, and thinking about, financial development, in the work on financial development, you have very different measures in the theoretical papers that are used. We can think about financial development as, Acemoglu and Ziliboti in terms of like missing assets that allow you to diversify. You can think about, as Doug is going to tell us about, higher pledgeability of the returns, and the implication of those different measures are going to be different. Okay, so I just want to, reiterate the role of theory within development economics, and so development and finance would be important. And I want to just plug in. So I think I was invited because I'm the president of an organization called FRED. For those of you who don't know, we are dedicated to theoretical research in development economics. And welcome, all type of paper. They can be empirical, but there need to be some theory that is involved. And so just stay tuned for the call for paper. We are going to be in Geneva May 28th and 29th. So now I want to, bring to the floor the other panelist, and our first panelist is Bob Townsend, whose 1994 study of resharing in Indian village and long-term work on finance in Thai village sparked lasting dialogue between theory and field data. I had asked you some question about, taking us back to your early work, and, how does the back and forth between theory and empirical work unfold? What are the particular challenges that you see when doing such work? And looking forwards, the area of theoretical finance that deserved renewed empirical attention, especially with the rapid digitalization of financial services. I don't know how to close it. Here. Control data. Here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity, and I've already learned a lot from the first panel. Looking forward to the interaction. So I wanted to address the prompts, but first of all, on this issue of the role of theory, my slides have prompts at the beginning, so you can remember what I've been asked to speak to. Development used to be a place that was largely driven by theory, this has dramatically changed with RCTs and new data sources. What's the current state? So I just wanted to sort of do a little promo here uh, with a reinforcing message that theory is alive and well. It's not gone away. And just to speak to where I'm coming from, MIT, students know this. They know that the ideal starting point is to start with theory, and to, or at least to embed theory in what they're doing. And the stronger students do it, and they do it well. And is already given an example with Tashira, uh, who's doing a postdoc at Princeton and then on to Stanford. We have several, including in this room, who have been placed at Harvard. It's often combined with other disciplines. That's a very insight that, in addition to doing development, will do trade, which is inherently more theoretically oriented, and those students are placing well at Princeton. And this year we have a student in development and finance going to Wharton. I also have a related news flash for those of you who don't know, from Cambridge, from MIT, which is a new MIT economics department with new course requirements to ensure that all students diversify and that they be broad. Well, why did we do this as a policy vote in the faculty committee? To learn new things from other fields. And in addition, that is to say, to what they're already doing in their majors and minors, to acquire new technical skills, something they don't know coming in that would augment that human capital. And you can't help but think that this is probably a good idea for selfish reasons, future job prospects in an increasingly uncertain world. And I would add, especially for the more junior people in the room, don't forget to enjoy your career. Graduate school is a sort of a unique opportunity to relax and just enjoy learning. And as to outside of MIT, outside of Cambridge, again, a lot of people in this room, RCTs scaled up to macro. Garance mentioned this already, from micro to macro development. Joe and Paco and I have a paper which is entirely a review of a large literature where theory is needed in order to think about the impact, the missing intercept of scaling up RCTs. And there are active groups. STEG is just one mention. Chris is involved with transformation and economic growth. Okay, so back to the prompts. The 1994 work on informal risk sharing in India spawned an active dialogue between empirics and theories. Talk us through how this dialogue emerged, lessons, etc. So what was my path as a theorist? My path was to look for arrow de Breu economies. And I can remember making this remark to Bob Lucas. And that took me to village economies. I didn't start with India. I started reading economic history and medieval village economies in particular, which may have a revealing subtitle. See if anybody smiles. A study of the Pareto mapping and general equilibrium models. And then the existing data with risk and insurance in village India. And subsequent to that, this is my path, field research, financial systems in northern Thai villages. And just to date myself a bit, at the time that I was, doing field research, very notable, unnamed development economists were saying that it is not the job of economists to go out and collect data. The world has changed for the better. The dialogue between theory and data, for a large part, it's a classical path. For risk and insurance in village India, you start with a good benchmark. That's the arrow de Breu thing for risk sharing. But you discover anomalies in the data, things that don't fit, idiosyncratic income does still show up to some degree, and it matters more for some than for others. So then the theory is which obstacles to trade get us closer to bridge the gap between the theory and the data, of which you can think about obstacles such as moral hazard, limited commitment, unobserved input, and various combinations of these. So one moral for me is don't just pick one. And if I dare say, macro kind of gets stuck in the obstacle du jour mode. We should be entertaining multiple obstacles and taking them into our models for the purposes at hand. And this iteration back and forth between data and theory, it's a lively debate with one thing informing the other and back again, and it continues even in this context of village economies. Lately, I threw in with a co-author, Hong, costly state verification to link to finance a bit, and it actually is the best fitting regime that happened after there was an RCT, quasi-experimental like innovation with respect to village funds. The other path, though, is from data to theory. So there isn't just one way to do this. And when we were in ICRISAT in Arapali village, we discovered in the field this cropping group. So cropping group consists of multiple tenants co-farming together under a common landowner. So they formed into groups and they're under contract with each other and with the landowner. And that coexists with single person sharecropping and long-term employment contracts, and coexists in, yet again with spot markets. All these things going on at the same time in these village economies. So the point to the theory is, with Ned Prescott, we began to think about groups, clusters, and group reassignments, and the role of beneficial hiding of information when they're switching groups. Beneficial, I want to emphasize. And firms as clubs and Walrasian markets with private information is, again, sort of embedding these clusters called firms into general equilibrium context. And that's the larger contribution to economic theory, is to think about, in the language of GE, the commodity point consists of a multi-agent contract. So contract theory is totally integrated into general equilibrium. It is not sort of doing one versus the other. And relatedly, redesigning markets, market design that came up in the earlier panel, you can think about buying and selling the rights to be in a cluster, which actually can handle problems that emerge with pecuniary externalities and things like asset fire sales. And I have my co-authors mentioned here in the slides as I go along. I just want to say, you don't start with theory and go to data, or data and go to theory. And again, for more junior people, if you can bear it in this world we live in, life is not scripted. Try to relax and have a good time with things, and the paths are unanticipated. So, for example, from the finance frame, Fama and French, we're studying stock market returns and the premium on stocks having to do with the correlation, the beta, with the market. So we took this idea into the Thai village setting, looking at the rate of return on production. So what is the rate of return? It could bear a risk premium if the activity you're doing is correlated with what other people are doing in the village. Actually, it's a remarkably good fit. I've showed this to John Campbell, for example, and it's like, wow, this is like better than the New York markets. Likewise, the flip side of this, the idiosyncratic risk, which is huge quantitatively, it bears much less, some yes, but much less of a risk premium. Why? Because of the risk sharing. They're sort of mutualizing that risk and sharing it with each other. In fact, when you start looking in these village economies, they start to look a lot more sophisticated than you might imagine. To some degree, they start looking like the New York financial markets in terms of the repo and the bridge loans and some work here that was already cited in an earlier panel. So there is a large premium, however, for village level risk, and it could be insured across villages, but it is actually not. So that led to this looking for partners. And I found one in Indonesia. It's a payments company working in not identical but similar environment. And we are trying to create the actual infrastructure that will help bridge across all these different villages and districts and regions. Now, when you come to private sector, as with GoTo, we're talking about big data, literally terabytes of data. But I see that as a complement, not as a substitute for this the theory data interaction. You can do fact finding on the existing data for one thing, which fuels testing and the need for theory. It surely speeds up relative to the 20 years I spent gathering, the data in Thailand. And you can do, and this was alluded to earlier, you can do RCTs with these private companies. They call them A/B testing. And you can do it in real time, and you can do it incrementally and sequentially, and so on. So all of which would be guided by the theory data interactions. And then it says two, but it isn't quite right. It's in parallel with Dejanir, we developed a finance model that was at scale what would happen if you improved the insurance level relative to what is out there now, and the impact is quite heterogeneous. And this is an overlapping generations model, so we can track out what's going to happen if the model were correct 20, 30, 40 years. And some people are actually made worse off by this intervention due to these, general equilibrium effects on the price of capital. So that should certainly give us pause. Actually, it should fuel the development more, thinking of these structural models, which is tough going because you can't put everything in there all at once, but it surely matters that something so compellingly needed could have, potentially have adverse consequences. And the last prompt was looking forward, are there areas of theoretical finance that deserve renewed empirical attention, especially with digitization? So in terms of the data, I would say network data. I'm involved in a project where we have the IOUs of firms, 45,000 of them, to be from Italy. And the idea is how to effectively clear the indebtedness and maximize the debt offset with minimal liquidity injections. So this involves computer science, which goes beyond network financial centrality. It has to do with chains, which are closed versus open cycles. And that's related to what, again, finance and the New York markets, where there are issues that arise with repo, and the idea, the regulations treat things as bilateral on balance sheet, but the problem is inherently multilateral, and you want to be able to basically facilitate the path of these repos through the broker dealers without running into these regulatory barriers. Central counterparty CCPs are often brought in from the SEC and academics as the solution, but we need to change the frameworks we're using because the new tools allow us to do much more in an efficient way. For empirics, yes, I think there is stuff for financial theory to be, aimed to address, but in part we need to address also the theory of finance. So let me give you two examples and the lesson. In Indonesia, it's a hybrid economy. They're using both cash, paper, as well as digital. And that interface going back and forth is really tough going. And actually, it's a pretty complicated problem, both mathematically and for the humans that have, that depend on reasonable decisions. Another example, empirically, financial systems for a long time, if you're reading economic history, have relied on credit clearing well before the advent of central banks and central bank money. And that actually, those lessons can be brought to bear in thinking about multiple fiat currencies across countries and how to design, better markets and platforms for international capital. I think the quest here is how to incorporate both money and finance together. And when you look at written work of Lucas, Sargent, and Wallace, it becomes transparent that finance is often ahead, and yet in reality, money is quite important. So I raise that as a challenge: how we can make more progress in getting those two things on the same page. And digitization goes beyond that term. With the new tools, we have blockchains, distributed ledgers, smart contracts, and encryption. And those, again, have the potential to redo finance as we've known it so far, because it's no longer true that you have to look at the whole balance sheet with assets and liabilities. You can look at individual items. They can be sequestered automatically in the code. You can write promises on top of promises, which are all composable and all consistent with each other because there's a common state on the ledger. So these are very powerful things that the new technology can bring. And it is being utilized in the Central Bank of Brazil. We've talked about regulators and how to bring them on board. And some central banks are actually leading the charge here in building better infrastructure. And to some degree, internationally, with the IMF and other agencies, we're building multi-currency exchange and contracting platforms. The point is not just to facilitate large value capital flows, but to actually reach into the SMEs and so on in these emerging market countries to get at the barriers. So yeah, we need to build models doing this and building domestic and international platforms. I'm very happy I've had a chance to be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very exciting. So now I want to introduce Doug Diamond. Does not need any introduction. And with seminal work on banking and financial fragility has reshaped how we think about intermediation.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I thought I was going to be asked the question, why are developing country banks so inefficient? And I'm like a banking, but no, I'm not actually standing up here. This is just a robot. And I guess it's one of the few jokes I can tell on a taped thing. So my answer, actually, to fit into what I'm going to talk about a little later, is that it's not so much about the banking, but it's so much what's going on in the corporate finance environment or the household finance environment in that country. And it's sort of about issues that are sort of close to like the law and finance people on pledgeability. So I'll get to that. So, but since I can ask and answer my own question. So when Emanuele asked me to talk on this, I reminded him that I'm not an expert on development economics. I could have done a little bit thinking about this on one dimension. I'll talk about that in a bit. And I followed the development stuff, and I guess we're all sort of a little on the same page. There is this issue that a lot of the big progress in development has been from the randomized clinical trials that have shown things that work very micro or things that don't work very micro. And the big problem is that you can't look at general equilibrium effects there unless you want to take over an entire country and try something or do something at the scale that Rob was doing. So apart from the work of Rob, very little general equilibrium stuff from economic theory in general has made it into development stuff. And I think that a lot of the issues, both in terms of welfare and particularly in terms of political economy, sort of might be a lot about what are the general equilibrium effects of certain approaches. So clearly, if you take a structural model and you have enough data and you believe the structural model, you can try to back out things that work like general equilibrium effects. Mainly in high-income country data, but also a little bit cross-sectionally. Dean Corbet from the University of Wisconsin has actually tried to look at things in the banking and in the corporate finance setup, thinking about bankruptcy, thinking about bank stability. So there's that, but that's tough stuff. That's difficult things to work on. So why do I think there's not? So then I'm a finance person, the finance theory, I use general parts of economic theory, but sort of finance theory has its own little special aspects. And as we heard on the previous panel, like not much of that has made it into development empirical work or development research. So I have a hunch that the part of finance theory that would be sort of the most useful, building on my comment about why banks in lower income countries are less stable, is about the parts of corporate finance theory based on the limited ability to commit to repay when somebody invests some money with you. So that's sort of the limited pledgeability, limited commitment. I'm sort of worried about that. Raghu Rajan and I wrote a series of papers of thinking about how banks can sort of help the financial system deal with that when there's sort of limited commitment to repay. Things like relationship lending can somewhat substitute for legal institutions. And it would help understand the structure of banks themselves. But I think you can actually do that gets pretty complicated. We can attest to that. Those papers took a long time. I think you can do pretty well in making some progress of just saying, look, even if the banks are doing something, the fundamental parts of the enforcement technology, say the bankruptcy laws in particular, the reorganization parts of the bankruptcy laws that like in the US context would be chapter 11, as opposed to, and sort of that's about trying to capture the going concern value of an entity versus like improved foreclosure rights, sort of collateralized lending or something like that, which is more, about getting repaid and potentially destroying the firm. So dropping the banks and then realizing the banks are in that system, and then, whenever I've done banking theory, with or without Raghu, it's always been trying to understand what's the problem that the banking contracts address. So I think making some progress on just the problems that the banking contracts address without thinking about the banks per se is a good way to go. And then you can think about sort of like there are financial markets that maybe have some frictions in them, but that you could think about how, this borrowing and lending problem is sort of a thought about when firms are investing, what do they invest in with the thought that they'll have to finance this investment? And we can think about the distortions, not just in the level of investment, but in the type of investment, sort of the relative distortions that financial constraints bring in. And then once we do that, we can think about general equilibrium effects. And the general equilibrium effects, as I hinted, may have redistributive effects, the redistributive stuff could play big time into the political economy. So why am I saying this? The idea is that if you take, these are hard models, Raghu and I have one that's like a basic toy model on it. But, if you're someone, pretty much the only person in the world that uses serious general equilibrium theory for applied work is Rob Townsend. So none of us are Rob Townsend, unfortunately, but you can actually, if you're thinking about general equilibrium effects, you can think about ways to address, look at the data. And you can also think about, intervention things. If this thing is going to cause a redistributive effect, even though it's efficient away from this group, how could you design something so you could overcome the resistance of that group? Okay, so and Manuel, I mentioned I don't like not talking about, I like to talk about papers. So I'm not going to present a paper, don't worry, but I'm going to talk about, like, as an example of the thing I'm talking about, of how you could use just this basic thing about bankruptcy laws, improvements in collection, easier to collect loans and pledgeability. So the fact, I haven't done much development work. I did some with the World Bank a number of years ago and built a model that was not about this. Is about the shortage of long-term financing available in lower income countries' economies. So financial development, one of the big symptoms of not having it is that you can't raise long-term funding. And long-term funding, the idea is going to be against fairly complicated, multi-stage projects like manufacturing or R&D or something, if you wanted to get way up there, versus short-term financing, which is sort of like financing inventories, the kind of household finance things we talked about, that improving access for people to, don't become shopkeepers or do very simple businesses. That's about what we're going to, well, think of as short-term finance. So if you have a weak financial system, sort of the only way you can get paid is to make sure that when the money comes in, you grab it. And then that's all about collateral rights. And then if that's all there is, you can't undertake these very complicated long-term projects. Recently, Raghu and I and Yunja Hu from Ohio State, from the University of North Carolina, have looked at the relative pledgeability of long assets versus short assets. So this is not about the access to finance. This is about which type of finance is there access, and how does that distort two things? Stuff that gets invested in, if it gets distorted, you get the relative things. And then also, it's a general equilibrium effect where this feeds back to the rates of return that are available to households. So the idea is that you sort of need something like collateral, the pledgeable part of some cash flow to do lending, and that you can pledge a different fraction of simple short-term projects than complicated long-term projects. And so I'll use this, I'm not going to present the model, don't worry. I'll use this as an example of a corporate finance-based setup. So here are just the assumptions of the setup. So they're short. This is very much, if pledgeability is 100%, this is exactly the Diamond-Dybvig model. But pledgeability is not going to be 100%. So it's going to be short-term assets that are constant returns to scale, that produce R units of output at date 1 per unit of input at date 0. They're long assets that produce X, which is bigger than R units of output at date 2 per unit of input at date 0. It's a static model. There are only 3 dates. And the idea is that the maximum pledgeable part of this short-term asset that returns R is gamma S times R, where gamma S is a number less than 1. And the long-term asset has a pledgeable part, gamma L times X. So the pledgeable part, is not 100%, but some fraction of the total output. And then the case that's going to be in economies with poor financial development is if that relative pledgeability is so different that the pledgeable part of short-term assets, which are less profitable, is bigger than the pledgeable rate of return you can promise on long-term assets, then there's going to be all kinds of distortions, all kinds of redistributions. And the idea is that financial claims, think of like, bonds, but really think about lending money. Financial claims, the claims that go to the provider of funds, the households, the consumers, the investors, whoever you want to call them, is produced out of the pledgeable part of asset payoffs by competitive producers. So we don't have any imperfect competition in here. So obviously, we talked about Dean Corbet before. One of the things that's important if you want to think about general equilibrium or complicated stuff is in the IO effects, right? So how much of the return gets passed through to the ultimate users of this product. Here, the ultimate users are the lenders, the investors. So we have perfect competition. Okay, so that has all kinds of interesting stuff. So there are interesting general equilibrium effects of increasing the pledgeability of short versus long assets. Improving the pledgeability of short assets, that's like making it easier to foreclose on inventory. It's like better monitoring of payment systems. Think of like how Amazon holds the inventory for the small vendors, so they can. So that's going to be short-term finance. And then long-term finance, there are lots of examples about, information asymmetry. The simplest one is think about making stuff that looks like Chapter 11 work better. So what do we learn? Increasing the pledgeability of long assets, like better bankruptcy laws, can actually end up hurting consumer investors. It actually lowers the rate of return that they end up getting on on their total portfolio of investments. Through a general equilibrium effect, basically through a substitution effect, where producers, because they have a hard time getting their claims on long-term assets to compete with the claims on short-term assets, because the short-term assets are more pledgeable, when you improve the pledgeability of long-term assets, you improve that gamma L, move it up closer to 1, it actually allows producers to substitute toward long-term assets, which are overall more profitable, but they're still less pledgeable. So if you move capital in the economy from a more pledgeable asset, more pledgeable rate of return offering to households to a less pledgeable, it ends up hurting households. That can't happen in what we call a developed economy, where this inequality is reversed, where the more profitable assets also can offer a higher pledgeable rate of return. Okay, so that's one thing that sort of fell out of the model, that you could think about the kind of thing one could look at. And increasing the pledgeability of short assets, making them even more able to outpledge the long assets, can end up hurting producers, because it's harder for them to finance long-term projects, which are more profitable, because the competition, the short-term stuff, is bigger. So this is a pretty standard substitution effect, like in micro, but when you put it into the general equilibrium, you get this idea that the political economy of who benefits and who loses from improving, say, your bankruptcy laws are sort of the opposite in less pledgeable economies than they are in developed economies. So this can help you, sort of, this is an example. It could be totally wrong. We haven't done any empirical work. Last empirical work I did was in second year in graduate school. And I decided I'm going to be a theorist. That was the process. But you need this is sort of a kind of thing where you need some kind of a model, and it has to be sort of general equilibrium to think about this. So that's, and I guess I have a couple more minutes, or yeah, okay, good. You haven't given me the 0 minute yet, or even the minute yet. So one more thing to say about it. So you get other interesting things out of it. So you can end up, if the short asset is enough more pledgeable, offer a higher rate, you can end up in an economy where you only have short-term finance, right? So that looks a lot like developing economies, and none of this complicated stuff can get financed at all, right? So that is, then you finance not very profitable projects. People don't build up net worth. When stuff isn't pledgeable, we know from all the macro finance literature, the only way to finance not very pledgeable stuff is internal finance. So if the entrepreneurs aren't getting rich, that, even if they have ideas, there's not much they can do. So looking at this, and this is not in our paper, but just since I had to think a little bit about it, if you take this kind of approach, if you think you're in this developing economy that doesn't have long-term finance, it's not going to really facilitate setting up secondary financial markets, because if these things are all maturing pretty quickly, they're all like 30 or 90-day loans, you're really not going to think about a secondary market. Even in US commercial paper, you don't see much of a secondary market, and those things are much more liquid than these would be. So the approach I took when I tried this stuff in 1997, liquidity banks and markets, was there's not much long-term finance, because the secondary market for long-term financial assets was highly illiquid. There was limited participation. So I think this pledgeability thing is a bigger and more important friction than that. But there is sort of an interaction. If you have all short-term finance, basically the banks can't do any liquidity transformation because their loans are short-term, their deposits are short-term. So the kinds of things that we think of banks of doing is sort of providing some kind of insurance against the need for liquidity. If this pledgeability stuff drives everything to short-term, the banks can't do that extra thing. So that could be another answer to your question. And this sort of, so this all sort of implies that the types of banking crisis you have when you have a poorly developed financial system, financial market, are going to be really different from the ones in developed economies. So developed economies, there's some notion of panics and fear itself, and the need for lender of last resort always being front and center, and deposit insurance. Basically, that we could see lots and lots of banking crises in developing economies, but it more has to do with the fact if the ultimate people who are borrowing money can only pledge a certain fraction of their future cash flows, the liquidity problems at the firm level means they can't pay their banks can't recover very much from them in the future. So we may think more about corporate finance issues in developing economies and more like banking system issues in developed economies. But I'd only thought about that like last night, so that could be wrong. So that's all I have to say.
So now I want to introduce Chang-Tai Hsieh, whose work on growth and structural change provide a unique perspective. And so I'm going to ask you the question. So in the 90s, there was a large literature that was studying growth and development, especially in cross-country setting. And a lot of the question why is capital not flowing from rich to poor country? And that research agenda seems to have stopped, unless I'm mistaken. And so the question is, why is that? Can we bring it back? And what are the big open questions that remains on that front?
Okay, so I'm just going to sit here. I didn't prepare slides, so I'm going to get to your question in a minute, but I want to frame it. So I would say that there has been it's been really difficult, right, to, I'm going to say, reconcile aggregate facts. But what I mean by aggregate facts, it's a combination of data that you would get from the national accounts, from the national accounts, and a combination of micro data from censuses, like where you see everybody, right? You see everybody with a lot of the theories and with a lot of the micro facts. And I'll make the point in 4 ways, right? So the first thing is in terms of your point, or the question that you asked. So Bob was working, working when the Penn-World tables came out. And what the Penn-World tables did is that it basically took all the data from the national accounts of all the countries of the world, and then it put on top of that data on prices. So one of the first pieces of data that we had from essentially national accounts was data on real investment, right? And that's a starting point. So when you look at data on real investment and you do the standard things, which is that you aggregate it to a capital stock, and you measure the differences in the capital to labor ratio across countries, you find that the differences are huge. So that was the context of Bob's question, right? Of that question, that you find that there are huge differences in the capital to labor ratio, and this would seem to imply, and it goes in the way that you think the capital labor ratios are high in countries that are rich and they're low in countries that are poor, and that would seem to imply that there are big differences in the return to capital. So the obvious question is, why doesn't capital flow from rich countries to poor countries? Okay. Now, that way of thinking, I mean, I don't want to call it theory because it's not even theory, right? Like, so the capital labor ratio tells you what it's a function of the return to capital. under the assumption that TFP is the same. Right, TFP, and sort of, if you read Bob's paper, he sort of, what he was aiming at was essentially a story of TFP. I mean, that was sort of the answer that he gave, right? The reason that capital does not flow is because, despite the big differences in the capital to the labor ratio, is that there are big differences in TFP across countries. That is, again, I don't want to dignify by calling it theory, but if you write down the Cobb-Douglas production function, the marginal product of capital is a function of TFP, and it's an inverse function of the capital to labor rate, of the capital to labor ratio. So the sort of the next, so almost immediately after sort of Bob wrote his paper, there were a series of papers that measured differences in TFP across countries, and it found that those differences were, as you would expect, huge, right? And then when you sort of put that together with the data on the capital to the labor ratios, what you find is that the differences in the return to capital are there, but they're just much, much smaller than what you would expect. So roughly, the rough stylized fact is that when you go from the richest country to the poorest countries of the world, the marginal product of capital differs by roughly a factor of 2. Right, it's a difference by a factor of 2, not by a factor of 30 or 40. So difference in a factor of 2, well, that's sizable, but what people took from that is that that's really not where the action is, right? Where the action is in trying to understand the differences in TFP. So that's sort of the first point.
But isn't it a bit the same thing, because the TFP is a residual, no?
Yeah.
So,
No. So of course. So,
yes.
but it's not. Let me just say that the next point, right? So the next aggregate fact, right, that came out is that it comes back to what the Penn World Tables people were doing. They were getting nominal data from the national accounts, and they were making it real. Right, they were making it real, and obviously, if you want to measure the real capital stock, that's what you want. Okay, now it turns out that so then the differences in the real investment rate is composed of 2 pieces. It's composed of differences in the nominal investment rate and differences in essentially the relative price of capital. Right, I mean that second piece is essentially what the Penn World Tables brought. The Somerset Heston people brought to the table. When you look at these 2 pieces, and so this was the second fact, right? The second fact, what you find is that the differences in the investment rate are all coming from the Penn World Tables people adjustment for prices. That is, if you look at differences in the nominal investment rate, they're no different. And also then what the other thing that you can do with the Penn World Tables is, or essentially what is that? It's essentially national accounts from all the, with all the issues with the national accounts data, but it's an aggregate. It's an aggregate that we should pay attention to, that with some assumptions, you can translate that into differences in a nominal savings rate. And when you look at it that way, there are no differences in the nominal savings rate between countries that are rich and countries that are poor, which sort of poses, all the people that want to write stories about how in poor countries there's something about financial markets such that people can't save, or that at least when you look at the aggregate data, it's hard to reconcile that, right? It's hard to reconcile it. Then sort of the next step, right, is, maybe it doesn't show up in the aggregates. Maybe it shows up in terms of the distribution, right? And that's sort of a lot of the stories that people have told, particularly in the first panel. Which is what I mean by the distribution is that it doesn't show up in aggregate, but maybe it's a small productive entrepreneurs that don't have access to capital, that don't have these, and then what the financial system does is that even if it doesn't show up in the aggregate, that it would show up in the distribution, right? And that's sort of the underlying, I would say, assumption of a lot of the randomized experiments of providing credit to small firms, cash grants to small firms, etc. Okay, this runs into another aggregate problem, like into an aggregate problem that there are now a couple of countries for which we have census data. That is, we have micro data from the censuses, and we now, so the aggregate, I'm going to call it aggregate, but it's micro data, right? It's micro data, but the difference is that it is representative of the entire distribution of firms. So we now have this for India, we have it for China, we have it for Mexico, we have it for Korea, we have it for Vietnam, for a bunch of countries, for
formal firms.
No, every firm. No, for every firm, including, like, for India, this is important, including all the firms that are in the informal sector. So if you want the details, I can tell you. But in India, the way that you have to do it is that you have to put together two data sets. There's a census of informal firms, and there's another census of the firms that are formal. Okay, so this is all, just to be clear, this is all observational data, right? It's all observation, but I think it's important, right, to look at. So when you look at it, when you look at the observational data, and when you say, if you impose a little bit of structure, like you impose Cobb-Douglas, then the marginal product of capital is going to be proportional to the average product of capital, right? That's what you get. Again, assuming that the first order conditions hold, assuming no adjustment costs. So there are all kinds of issues involved in doing that. When you look at the census data, like in that way, it's actually really, really difficult to find evidence that the marginal product of capital in small firms is higher than that of the large firms. If anything, the pattern shows exactly the opposite. Like the pattern, I mean, it's not big. It's not big, but the patterns show that when you look at at least the average, let me be clear on what this is. The average product of capital if you look at the largest firms, is typically larger than that of the smallest firms. Right, which then blows, again, with all the assumptions that you have to make to blows a whole hole in sort of like all these theories on, oh, it's a small entrepreneurs that are kind of constrained. I mean, you can try to rescue it, but then you need to say, oh, maybe there are other things such that about small versus the large firms, a large firm. One way in which you could possibly rescue this is that, and this comes from a project that I've been doing with my colleague in the econ department, Esteban. It's been this thing that we've been doing for 10 years now. It's that we've long known, but we never had any data that the largest firms, so let me take a step back. Okay, the data the census data is all data. The unit of observation is a firm, right? It's the registered firm. Now, it's well known. I would say, I've not until that largest firms. There is a big, or if you think about it in the case of India, when you look at one firm with 1,000 workers and another firm with 1,000 workers, they can be very different because one could be part of a big corporate group and the other one is not, right? Now, none of that is observable in any census data because there's no information on ownership, right? There's no information. So part of what Esteban and I have been doing is that it's taken us 10 years to piece together ownership data. So we now have data on, say, the largest conglomerates, right? In 4 countries. We've done it for the U.S., we've done it for Mexico, we've done it for India, and we've done it for Korea. And then what you see, I mean, there's a ton of interesting stuff, like because the largest companies they do very different things. Like in India, they seem to do one thing. In Korea, they do something else. In the US, they do something completely different. But when you look at it in terms of the return to capital, like that's when you start to see something. Like that's when you start to see something that is the largest firms in a conglomerate, the return to capital is lower, right? But most 1,000-person firms are not in conglomerates. but it's a one in the conglomerates that start to look very different. So maybe so that you need to go out, to the top 50 conglomerates to be able to sort of see this belief that people have, to find evidence of this belief that people have, that large firms have great access to capital and small firms are screwed. But in general, on average, that's just not true, right? So then, and I said it's these pieces of evidence, I would say, that I think, to get at your question of sort of why, I guess I would put it this way, right? I would put it this way, that people who think about this from the macro perspective, who think about finance, that is, what they're trying to do is to basically say, how can we think about models in which it doesn't show up in the aggregates, but then ways in which it would show up in terms of aggregate TFP. I mean, and that's sort of the discipline. That's sort of the discipline that I would say the aggregate data forces on you, because you don't see it, at least in simple models where there's a bunch of simple models you can write down in which it would show up in the aggregate, right? But it doesn't, right? Now let me turn to sort of the fourth fact, right? The fourth fact that I think people are struggling with, which is there's one country that in the last 15 years in which they have done a ton in terms of improving the financial sector, right? They've done a ton of, and that's China, right? Yeah. And they're basically three main things that have happened in China. One is basically the creation, I can't get into, I don't have time to get into the details, but starting in 2008, there's been the creation of what in China is called these local financing vehicles, and there are about 9,000 of them. So these are basically, think of this as being roughly the equivalent of a Berkshire Hathaway's. And what they've done is a combination of funding startups, buying equity in a lot of firms, and it's big. The annual flows of money that are coming through these local financing vehicles is about 15% of a GE, about 15% of GDP. Wow. The other piece of it is sort of the explosion of, I'm going to say, access to finance on the part of households through WeChat money and Alipay money. And then the third piece is also sort of, I'm going to say, what people think as the improvement of financial, on sort of the backbone of financial institutions, which is there's now a bankruptcy law, there's now a system of bankruptcy courts, there's a credit registration system. So all of these things, right? And what's been the consequence? The consequence is just a vast expansion of credit, right? When you look on aggregate, you see the effect. When you look at the aggregate return to capital, it's fallen from about 25% to about 10%, right? And what's been the other effect? That TFP growth used to be 6-7%. It used to grow at 6-7% of GDP, and it's fallen to roughly zero, right? It's roughly to roughly. So that is the other big puzzle. I'm going to say it's a macro puzzle. Obviously, you can say that, a ton of other things have happened in China at the same time, of course, right? So as with all macro facts, there's no, but it's an important macro fact. And it's such an important macro fact that I say that if you've been watched the news a little bit, right, that the view now of the authorities of the Communist Party is that all this finance stuff is bonkers. So there's now, they have responded in a way that probably only they know how to respond, which is they've now implemented an anti-finance campaign, right? So they basically say, we're going to cut the salaries of people in finance by 50%. By 50%, we are going to defund all the finance and the business schools, and we're going to crack down on the finance sector, because of the view that, they sort of have this view that what the finance sector is that it generates all this misallocation, right? And this is sort of the if you've seen what has happened, there's been this push of what the Chinese call the new qualitative productive forces. We want semiconductors. We want semiconductors. We want EVs. We want batteries. So we're going to push those sectors. Finance is explicitly what if to just use the same term, it's the old unproductive sectors, and we're going to crack down on finance. So that's been what's happening in China. Now, obviously, that could all be wrong, right? But again, it's a macro fact, right? Okay, so I'll end there.